What better way to start off the Evo build by modifying an already modified car? Now on the front bumper there is a small slit, and usually you'd need to put in a small canard there, and I really don't like the look of canards in general, and specifically on this one it didn't really fit all that well, and I just didn't think it will fit in nicely with my design, so I just removed it. I filled in the hole or the slit with some, to me, a light curing putty, sanded it smooth, and then it was time to move on to the next step, that was scribing out all the panel lines. Now during the unboxing I already mentioned that they were pretty darn good and didn't really need all that much attention, so most of them just got one or two scribes and then I could move to the other ones, and some did need a little bit more attention, but overall this was a really short step with not much needs to be done there. So I could then move on to sanding it down with some 600 grit before moving it into the spray booth for some primer. I was recently contacted by Gallery if I wanted to test out some of their airbrushes. Now usually you'd see me use my Mr. Hobby airbrushes, the PS290 or the PS275, and a little bit further back in my history I was using a lot of Harder and Steenbeck airbrushes, which performed really well but for most people are a little bit too expensive. Now the airbrushes that Gallery has to offer are a little bit cheaper, and therefore I was kind of interested to see if they could catch up with the quality of the more expensive airbrushes that I'm using, and wanted to share the experience with you guys. Now I will also be giving away this airbrush in my web shop. Order number 25 from the time that this video goes live will get the airbrush. If it is in your order, then you won it, and if it's not, then you didn't. So check out the scalemodelingchannel.shop, and again, order number 25 will win this airbrush. It has been used and tested by me in this video series, so it is a proper airbrush and I would kind of recommend it, but to know more about that, be sure to check out the rest of the video and I will let you know a bit more of my thoughts on this airbrush. Now prior to starting this build, I have never used this airbrush at any point in time. I simply just unboxed it, assembled it where necessary, and then started with the primer. First initial coat, I put the 0.3mm needle in it, and it went pretty good, but it kind of felt like it needed a lot more pressure and wasn't letting out as much paint as I'd like, but that is kind of what you can expect with a 0.3 needle. That's more for smaller detailed work and maybe even some more artistic work. So after that first initial coat, I decided to switch it out to the 0.5, so I had a lot more paint flow out and go onto the model as I desire, and that worked a lot better. Now with the normal airbrushes I use, I do not need to thin the paint any more than it already is straight out of the bottle, but in this case I did feel like it needed a little bit more thinners just to flow out a little bit nicer and get a smoother finish, so I just added about 10% more thinners to the mixture of the paint straight out of the bottles from Street Blisters and Splash. It comes pre-thinned, so about 10% more for it to flow out nicely with this airbrush. Now that's not really a downside to the airbrush, it's just something to get used to. So with the primer applied, I let that cure for a couple of hours, give it a very light sanding with some 3000 grit sanding sponges to remove any dust in it. The overall finish was really nice and smooth, so I'm really happy with that. And I could then move on to applying the white base coat, which looks pretty much exactly the same as the primer. That is the downside of using a light primer and a light color. And then after that I applied another coat and that looked exactly the same as well. It went on really nice and smooth, so no complaints there whatsoever. And when that was done, I could move on to the special finish, and that was a holographic pearl finish from Splash Paints. Now again, just like the white, you could not see me apply anything pretty much here apart from moving around the airbrush, so as far as video goes, that's not really the greatest color to choose, but the overall effect that I was going for was achieved, and I will be showing some close-up video of it once the clear coat is applied, and also some other photos at the end of the video. In the meantime, you've already seen me start to apply the black. Now of course, after the paint had been applied, I let that cure overnight before masking off the roof in order for the black to be applied on top of that. And while I applied the first coat and let that cure, I moved on to painting some other parts that also needed to be gloss black at the same time. And then once those were all done with the first coat, I could move on to the roof for a second coat to get that fully covered. Now you can see the paint being applied a lot better here, as it's more obvious of a difference, of course. And the paint did go really nicely, exactly how much I wanted it to and where I wanted it to, and the overall finish is pretty good. Now there was a little bit of dirt on the roof and a little bit of dirt landed in the paint, so the overall finish is not as smooth as I'd like it to be, but overall after the clear coat will be applied, that should smoothen out a lot and achieve the result that I'm after if there isn't too much dirt landing in it while it is curing. Now as usual, same with any other build, first go to the hard to reach, easy to forget spots and then move on to the rest. So at this point I'm still using the 0.5 needle, and that is working pretty well. For the first initial coat I just mixed up the clear that I usually mix, same mixing ratios as described on the package, nothing special there, just to see how it would come out. And as expected, same with the colors and the primers, it did require a little bit more thinner in order for it to flow out nicely and get the smooth finish that I'm after. So of course on that second coat that I will be applying a little bit later, I did add a bit more thinners to the mixture and that did improve it, but overall no really big complaints, just again something to keep in mind. The finishing that this airbrush is capable of doing is really nice and really smooth, specifically keeping in mind the price point of these airbrushes. Now that I've used the airbrush a little bit on this build, I've gotten used to it a little more and already found a couple of small points that were a little annoying. Now, this is a trigger style airbrush and the springs in it are pretty heavy, so it needed quite a lot of pressure from my fingers to press it in and in order to get all of the paint out of it that I wanted. Now that does give you a little bit more control, as it's not that easy to press in the trigger fully by accident, but it requires a little bit more pressure than usual from my other airbrushes. Now again, not a big deal, but something to take into consideration when using it, and once you're used to it, it will probably get pretty normal down the line. Now the other thing, the trigger is kind of sharp on the bottom, and with the way that I wrap my finger around it, it does poke into my finger a little bit, so after using it for a small amount of time, it does get a little bit annoying and irritating to my finger, but again, something you probably could get used to. Overall, just small complaints, but keeping the price point in mind, nothing major, and specifically when looking at the finishing that this airbrush is capable of, probably something that you shouldn't care about all that much at all, specifically again for the price point. Now, when talking about the price point, I could consider this more of a beginner airbrush. If you're serious and want to move on to airbrushing, then probably getting a more expensive one and investing in it is a bit better of an idea. But if you want to just get your feet wet with airbrushing for the first time and not really sure if this is something for you, then these airbrushes are perfect for you. They are cheaper and they are easy to replace. They do offer a ton of spare parts, so if you mess something up, you can just buy some new spare parts instead of buying a new airbrush. And again, they are not that hurtful to the wallet, so it's a good first initial airbrush quality wise and finishing wise, and just again to get your feet wet. And if you're interested in getting one of those, either be order number 25 in the TSMC web shop or check out the links down below where you can order your own. So just to sum it up, this is an airbrush worth getting if you're a beginner airbrusher or just want to give it a go. And for the more advanced airbrushers, it might be something nice to add to your toolbox for a different style of airbrush with a different size of needle. But if you already have a high quality airbrush, I'm not really sure that this is the right replacement for it. Maybe just stick to that one. The finishing is really nice, and as I've mentioned in the video, it's not really all that clear on camera, so I took some extra shots right here just to give you the effect of the pearl. The roof is just a straight jet black with a bit of dust in it, so that might need a little polishing, and the white is now a pearl holographic white with a nice flick into it. Now again, it is really hard to capture on camera, as some of the angles and the capability of my camera are simply not there. But with different types of light, it gives a different kind of color. some purples, some blues, some pinks, and every other holographic color imaginable. It is a little bit better to see on some of the pictures that I've added at the end of the video, but overall a really nice cool flip to the paint and not something overly in your face. So exactly what I was going for. I'm now just going to leave this to dry for a little bit and then move on to the interior in the meantime and give the airbrush an even further use to see if it is up to standards.